The three-tone foghorn of USS Resolute split the afternoon air above Naval Station Norfolk at 14:30 hours. 2 short, 1 long, the standard signal that a Tier 1 NATO evaluation exercise had officially begun. 216 personnel aboard the carrier adjusted their posture in unison, as if the sound itself carried rank. Nobody looked at the woman scrubbing the K-9 deck. She moved on her knees across the floor of the kennel bay on the carrier's lower port side, working a utility mop in methodical, overlapping arcs, left quadrant to right, never backtracking, never skipping. Her uniform was the pale blue of a civilian contractor, faded enough to suggest multiple wash cycles, stiff enough to suggest she hadn't worn it long. The name patch above her left breast read Dahlia in standard block lettering. No unit crest, no service ribbon, no rank insignia of any kind. Nothing to indicate she belonged on a warship preparing for one of the most scrutinized joint exercises of the fiscal year. The kennel bay held 14 dogs, Belgian Malinois, German Shepherds, 1 Dutch Shepherd with a scar across his left ear. All military working dogs, all trained to threat detection standards that civilian handlers spent careers trying to match. 14 individual kennels, 14 animals with enough combined operational hours to fill a small library of after-action reports. The one in Kennel 7 watched her, Titan. 18 months old, 67 pounds of focused muscle and conditional trust. His handler, a young specialist named Aiden, had logged 3 separate incident reports in the past 4 months. Not because Titan was uncontrollable, but because the dog's threshold for new contact was exactly calibrated to 0. You did not touch Titan without earning it. Most people on this ship had not earned it. Most people on this ship knew better than to try. Titan's dark eyes tracked Dahlia from corner to corner of the kennel bay. She did not acknowledge him. She worked. Her hands moved with a specific economy. Not the loose efficiency of someone going through the motions, but the compressed precision of someone who had learned to conserve every movement. She wrung out the mop head with 2 fingers and a wrist rotation, the way a person wrings out a cloth after field cleaning a suppressor. She oriented herself to the room's geometry without looking up. 4 exits, 2 primary, 2 emergency, 1 with a faulty latch that required a secondary pull. She had checked it 17 minutes ago without appearing to check anything at all. The kennel bay door opened with a pressure seal hiss. "Hey!" The voice had the texture of a direct order. Colonel Cassian filled the doorframe the way certain men fill doorframes. Not with size alone, but with the conscious projection of it. He was newly assigned to USS Resolute's K-9 integration unit, transferred from Fort Bragg with a service record that looked excellent on paper and a management style that looked worse in person. 2 junior officers trailed him, maintaining the exact distance of men who had learned not to walk too close. Dahlia did not look up immediately. She finished the arc she was on, set the mop head in the bucket, and stood. The motion had no urgency and no performance. She simply rose when she was done. "This area is restricted during exercise protocol," Cassian said. "Civilian contract personnel are not authorized on this deck." "Apologies, Colonel. I'll clear out." Her voice landed flat, not afraid, not aggravating, just flat, the way water is flat. Cassian studied her, the way men study objects they've decided are misplaced. His gaze moved from the worn sneakers to the contractor badge clipped at her hip. "Who authorized you down here?" Before Dahlia could answer, Kennel 7's door rattled. Not from aggression, not with the high-pitched whine of an agitated animal. The kennel latch clicked twice. The spring mechanism did what spring mechanisms do when pushed from the inside with exactly the right amount of lateral pressure, and Titan walked out. He moved without running, a purposeful trot across the bay floor, past the 2 junior officers who stepped back without meaning to, past Cassian, who had not yet processed what was happening, all the way to the woman in the pale blue uniform. And then Titan lay down. He placed his chin on the toe of Dahlia's left shoe. The kennel bay went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something impossible has just happened in front of witnesses. Cassian looked at the dog, looked at the woman, looked back at the dog. His jaw moved once, as if testing whether language was still available to him. Aiden, who had been running a feed check on the far side of the bay, stood with a scoop of kibble suspended in midair and said nothing. In 20 minutes, nothing on this ship would be the same. But, right now, nobody in the kennel bay understood that yet. And Dahlia had no intention of explaining it to them. Subscribe right now, if you're new here, because this story is only getting started. Dahlia hasn't said 10 words, and already the most dangerous dog on this carrier won't move from her feet. Colonel Cassian is furious. The crew is confused, and nobody knows why Titan just chose her. Don't go anywhere. The answer is going to hit you like a freight train. Cassian recovered his voice on the second attempt. Specialist. He snapped the word at Aiden like a thrown object. Get that animal back in its kennel, now. Aiden crossed the bay, crouched beside Titan, gripped the collar, applied controlled pressure, the standard repositioning technique for a resistant animal. Titan did not growl. He did not snap. He simply did not move. His chin remained on Dahlia's shoe with the unhurried certainty of a 40-pound anchor. He's not responding to physical redirection, sir, Aiden said, which was possibly the most carefully worded understatement anyone had produced on this vessel all week. Cassian's attention shifted back to Dahlia. I don't know what you did to that animal, and I don't have time to find out right now. You have 30 seconds to remove yourself from this deck before I make it an administrative problem. Dahlia looked at Titan for a moment. Just a moment, 2 seconds at most, then picked up her mop bucket by the handle. Understood, Colonel. She walked toward the exit. Her gait was unhurried, spaced, heel to toe in a pattern that covered distance without appearing to rush. Her back was perfectly straight. She did not look over her shoulder, not once. Aiden noticed her hands. She carried a 10-pound mop bucket by the handle using 2 fingers, not her palm, the way a person carries something light who has also carried much heavier things than this. The bay door sealed behind her. Titan stood, walked back to Kennel 7, and lay down inside without being asked. On the deck above, Major Fletcher was mid-handshake with a Norwegian naval attaché, whose name contained 3 consecutive vowels and who was clearly impressed by the carrier's operational scale. Fletcher was the kind of officer who weaponized charm, broad-shouldered, easy smile, the habit of standing slightly closer to important people than necessary. He had the instinct of someone who understood that visibility and competence were not the same currency, but that the first one often purchased opportunities for the second. He saw Dahlia emerge from the stairwell onto the transit corridor. Hey, maintenance. He called it over his shoulder without breaking eye contact with the attaché, as though the correction required no more effort than adjusting a thermostat. Wrong deck. Contractor support is 2 levels down. Dahlia walked past without responding, which Fletcher would interpret as compliance, and Aiden, who had followed at a distance, would later recognize as something else entirely. The junior specialist caught up to her at the corridor junction near the supply room. He was 22, recently requalified on K9 handling protocols, and possessed of the particular discomfort of someone who had watched something unfair happen and said nothing. He was carrying 2 mugs of coffee from the enlisted mess. Ma'am, he extended one. Sorry about back there. Colonel Cassian he's new to the unit. He doesn't always... Aiden stopped himself. Started again. He doesn't always take time to understand the context before he acts. Dahlia accepted the mug. She held it with 2 fingers. Thank you, she said. That was all. They stood in the corridor for a moment. Aiden tried to find an opening that wasn't invasive. How did you get Titan to do that? He doesn't do that. With anyone. Dahlia looked at him over the rim of the mug. I didn't do anything. But he made a decision, she said. Animals are very good at those. Better than us, usually. She took 1 sip of coffee, set the mug on the corridor ledge, and moved toward the supply room. Don't let him miss his afternoon intake. He eats slower when he's agitated, and if he underfuels before a drill, he'll front-load muscle tension in his hindquarters. Aiden stood very still for a moment after she'd gone. He had been handling working dogs for 14 months. Nobody had ever told him that. Not his supervisor, not his certification instructor, not the veterinary protocol documents he'd read 3 times. He went back to check on Titan's food intake. In the ship's tactical briefing room, Admiral Solomon stood at the head of a lacquered table that had survived 4 deployments and 2 Atlantic storms, reviewing material he had not needed to reference notes for in a decade. He was 61 years old, trim, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent so long giving instructions that his body had learned to conserve everything else. When he spoke, people stopped doing other things, not because of volume, he rarely raised his voice, but because of the quality of certainty in it. He was outlining K9 unit integration capability to the NATO evaluation panel when Cassian entered, waited for the appropriate pause, and reported. K9 unit is now operational under my command, Admiral. All 14 animals accounted and kenneled. Solomon tapped the briefing board with 1 knuckle, a thinking gesture, not an approval one. Deployment readiness for Thursday's drill? On track, sir. Good. Solomon turned back to the panel. Also, sir, Cassian added, I removed an unauthorized contractor from the K9 deck, civilian veterinary technician. She didn't have proper access clearance for active exercise periods. Solomon did not look up. Was there an incident? No, sir. Then it's handled. He returned to the panel briefing with the finality of a man who had allocated that topic exactly as much mental space as it deserved. Cassian stood for one more second, the second of a man who expected his news to create a larger ripple, and then withdrew. Lieutenant Commander Iris was 3 decks up, running clearance verification on the NATO delegation support staff, when an automated flag appeared in her queue. A contractor badge scan from the Kennel Bay at 13:53 hours had returned a partial verification. The system had processed the badge number, but could not complete the employment chain authentication. The contracting company listed was Allied Vet Services, registered out of Norfolk. The onboard contract manifest for this week did not include Allied Vet Services. It was a small discrepancy. These happened. Paperwork moved slowly between Shore Command and Ship Administration, especially during high-tempo exercise windows. Iris opened the contractor's personnel file anyway. She was thorough by disposition, which was most of the reason she had reached Lieutenant Commander by 34. Name, Dahlia, badge, C477 Alpha, Social Security number, on file, employment history, Allied Vet Services, civilian veterinary technician. Before that, a gap. 9 years of nothing. Before the gap, a single entry. United States Navy, Veterinary Corps. Service dates followed by a code that resolved to, and then the record simply stopped. Not redacted, not classified. Just absent, the way a page is absent when it has been removed from a binder so carefully that the torn edge is invisible. Iris leaned back in her chair, looked at the screen, looked at it again. She ran a standard background check extension. The system spun for 11 seconds, longer than usual, and returned a single-line result. Query elevated. Requires Level 4 clearance confirmation. Level 4. On a civilian veterinary technician. Iris picked up her handset and began composing a request to Commander Intelligence. On the lower deck, Lieutenant Ronan found Dahlia in the supply annex, reviewing the controlled substance log for the veterinary kit. He was the kind of officer who used questions the way some men used handshakes, as instruments of measurement rather than exchange. He had a master's degree in veterinary pharmacology from a program that most military personnel had never heard of. And he carried that credential the way certain people carry expensive watches, visibly and with purpose. He walked to the whiteboard beside her and stood in a way that blocked it without technically blocking it. "Do you know the difference?" he said, in the tone of someone who already knows the answer. "Between ace-promazine and metatomidine in a K9 sedation protocol?" Dahlia did not look up from the log. Ace-promazine has a longer duration and provides better muscle relaxation, but it lowers blood pressure and has no analgesic effect. Metatomidine provides both sedation and analgesia, shorter duration, reversible with etipamazole, which you want if your animal is a working dog who needs rapid return to function. She turned a page. Ace-promazine is a mistake in high-stress combat environment animals because it produces what looks like calm while leaving the sympathetic nervous system active. The dog is sedated but physiologically still running hot. Vets who don't know that cause injuries during field procedures. She said this in the same register most people use to report the weather. Ronan stood very still. He had prepared a follow-up question. He did not ask it. "Is there something specific you needed?" Dahlia said. "No," Ronan said. He left. From the corridor junction where he'd been standing since following at a careful distance, Sergeant Major Boyce had heard the entire exchange. He was a thick-shouldered man with 22 years of service, and the cultivated instinct of someone who had learned that information was the only currency that never devalued. He pulled his personal phone from his pocket and took a photograph of Dahlia through the supply annex window. She did not look up. Boyce had grown up in a household where credit went to the one who reported it first. Some childhood lessons are hard to unlearn. 3 decks up, Admiral Solomon was wrapping his briefing when the door opened and Captain Hugo entered, crossing directly to Solomon's position and delivering a brief, low exchange. Solomon's expression did not change. He thanked the NATO panel, excused himself efficiently, and moved to the corridor. "What's the security flag?" Solomon asked. Hugo kept his voice below corridor traffic. "Iris and Intel has a contractor with a partially verified badge and an employment history that's raising questions. Lower K9 deck. Cassian already flagged someone from that deck. Same individual, sir. Iris is escalating the background query. She's hitting clearance walls she shouldn't be hitting on a civilian veterinary technician." Solomon filed that away with the quiet precision of a man who had learned that anomalies on a vessel this size were rarely coincidences. "Keep her on the ship until we understand what we're looking at. No shore access." "Yes, Admiral." What neither man yet understood, what nobody on the ship yet understood, was that the order to keep Dahlia aboard USS Resolute was the first decision in this sequence of events that was going to work out in anyone's favor, including theirs. The afternoon shifted. The NATO evaluation panel moved through its briefing schedule with the careful efficiency of international observers who understood that their presence was itself a form of pressure. Major Fletcher guided them through 3 presentations on integrated naval operations, then moved toward the scheduled live K-9 demonstration before the evening meal. Cassian had selected Titan for the demonstration. Not randomly, Titan's certification scores were the highest in the unit, and Cassian had reviewed the performance logs before selecting the animal. On paper, it was the correct choice. In practice, Titan had other considerations. The demonstration began in the auxiliary training bay, with Cassian running the control position and 2 handlers managing perimeter. The exercise was a standard building search, simulated room entry, suspect identification, controlled apprehension. Titan had completed this protocol, by Aiden's count, over 400 times. He completed 2/3 of it. At the transition point between room entry and apprehension target engagement, Titan stopped, not with aggression, not with distraction. He simply sat down in the middle of the exercise space and turned his head in the direction of the supply annex corridor 2 sections away, as if he could hear something through the bulkhead that no one else could. Cassian repeated the command. Standard handler vocal cue, appropriate intensity. Titan's ears moved, his body did not. Fletcher, standing with the Norwegian attaché and 2 French naval officers, produced a laugh that was calibrated to sound like amusement, and functioned as an apology. Different method of cooperation, he offered. Working dogs have creative interpretations sometimes. The Norwegian attaché nodded politely and wrote something in his assessment booklet. Aiden watched from the bay's edge. He had been running the previous feeding round and had stayed to observe. He saw Titan's eyeline. He understood the geometry of it. He walked quietly to the corridor. Dahlia was returning the controlled substance log to its secured drawer when she heard Aiden's footsteps. "Ma'am." He stopped at the supply room doorway, visibly uncertain about the protocol of what he was about to ask. I know it sounds odd, but Titan isn't performing. He's not responding to command, and I noticed he's looking in the direction of this corridor." Dahlia finished securing the drawer lock. "It has nothing to do with me." "With respect, ma'am, I think it does. I've handled that animal for 14 months. He has never done what he did this morning, with anyone." He paused. "What's happening in that demonstration bay affects my unit's evaluation score. I know you're not supposed to be near the K-9 area, but if there's something you can do, I'm not authorized to enter that bay." "I know." Dahlia looked at him. Not the quick assessment glance she'd used with Cassian and Ronan and Boyce. This was longer, as if she was deciding something that had actual weight. She walked to the corridor junction that ran parallel to the training bay's starboard wall. Through the narrow observation window, the kind that existed on Navy ships for ventilation monitoring, she could see the demonstration space. Titan sitting, Cassian's jaw tight, the NATO panel watching. She raised her right hand and knocked twice on the wall panel beside the window. The rhythm was specific, short, long, the same syncopation a drum uses to settle a room. Through the glass, Titan's head came up. The dog stood, re-engaged his handler position, and completed the apprehension sequence with precision that made the French naval officer stop writing and simply watch. The apprehension was clean, the release was controlled, and the return to handler position was exact. The panel applauded. Fletcher exhaled through his nose in what Aiden recognized as profound relief. Cassian turned toward the starboard wall. The observation window was empty. Dahlia had already moved. Aiden found her at the galley hatch, collecting a water container she'd apparently requisitioned for the kennel bay. He was still processing what he had just witnessed, and his face showed it. "Rehydrate him before the next session," she said, handing him the container. "He's been in a heightened arousal state since this morning, and his water consumption is low. If he cramps during Thursday's drill, the evaluation number is going to drop further than it would have today." Aiden took the container. "Ma'am, with respect, who are you?" Dahlia looked at him for a moment. "Dahlia, contractor, Allied Vet Services." She said it with the specific evenness of someone who has repeated a sentence so many times it has become as neutral as breathing. Aiden did not push further, but he carried the container back to the kennel bay with the particular weight of a man who understood that the answer he'd received was not the same thing as the truth. In the intelligence workstation on Deck 3, Iris was watching a loading bar move across her screen with the patience of someone who had learned that the Pentagon's database architecture was a historical artifact produced by 17 sequential contract awards and nobody's idea of efficiency. She had escalated her request to Commander Intelligence. The queue had processed. The authentication had cleared. The Level 4 window was opening. She clicked. The file loaded in segments. Public record first, then service record, then the restricted layer. Then, Iris's hands stopped moving. She read the top line twice. Then she pushed back from the workstation and stood up. She was not a woman who stood up quickly. She was a woman who processed before she moved. She stood up quickly. "Hugo," she said, crossing to the hatch. "I need to speak with the Admiral, right now." Hugo looked up from his own workstation. "Is this a wait 5 minutes conversation or a bring Cassian?" Boyce found Cassian in the corridor outside the tactical briefing room. He showed him the photograph on his personal phone, Dahlia in the supply annex, facing the controlled substance log. "She's been in there twice," Boyce said. "Once this morning, when she wasn't supposed to be on deck at all. Once this afternoon, with full access to the veterinary pharmacological inventory." Cassian studied the image. "And she touched Titan's collar. I saw it. She removed something, examined it, replaced it. I don't know what she was looking for, but that dog has a tracking chip, and she clearly knows where it is." Cassian's jaw worked. He thought about the demonstration, about Titan responding to a knock on the wall from a woman who was not in the room, about the pharmacology exchange Ronan had described, about the employment gap that Iris had flagged. He forwarded Boyce's photograph to Solomon's secure line with a single note attached: "Request security assessment. Possible unauthorized access to K9 asset data." Then he went to find Dahlia himself. The supply room was empty when Cassian arrived. He was told she was in the enlisted mess. She was not. He was told she had signed out for a water requisition. He traced that back to Aiden, who reported she had already delivered the container and moved on. He found her in the kennel bay, standing outside Kennel 9, looking at a shepherd mix named Rex, not entering, not touching. Standing at the observation distance that even authorized handlers maintained with an unfamiliar animal. Rex was favoring his left foreleg. Dahlia was watching the way the dog shifted his weight when he changed positions, the way his shoulder dropped microscopically on the turn. She had her arms at her sides. She had not yet moved. Aiden was in the bay, saw her first, said nothing. "What are you doing?" Cassian said. "Rex has a grade 2 soft tissue strain in the left carpal joint," Dahlia said, without turning. "He's been compensating with his opposite foreleg for at least 3 days. If he goes into Thursday's drill unaddressed, the compensation pattern is going to load the right foreleg abnormally, and you'll end up with 2 injured animals instead of 1. Cassian stopped. "How do you know that?" "Gait pattern and shoulder drop during lateral transitions." She finally turned to look at him. "Do you want me to splint him or not?" Cassian opened his mouth, closed it. He was a man who had spent his career understanding the architecture of authority, and Dahlia was standing inside his building using load-bearing walls he had not put there. "You don't have authorization to treat animals on this vessel," he said. "I know," she said. "So you should probably have your veterinary officer do it in the next 4 hours. I'll write the protocol if that helps." She walked past him toward the exit. Not fast, not slow. The same unhurried cadence that had moved through this ship all day, leaving identical ripples in every room she passed through. Cassian stood in the kennel bay with 14 dogs and 1 specialist who was pointedly studying the far wall, and he felt, for the first time since boarding USS Resolute, that the situation he was managing was considerably larger than the situation he thought he was managing. Rex received appropriate care within the hour. Aiden logged the treatment. Nobody formally authorized the protocol that had appeared on a paper towel in Rex's kennel doorway, written in a small, precise hand with no signature. The protocol was correct. Veterinary Officer Lieutenant Norbert confirmed it with the specific reluctance of a man validating instructions he hadn't written. In the supply annex, Dahlia sat in a folding chair at 1640 hours and ate a late lunch she had retrieved from the enlisted mess. A young sailor named Blake sat 2 seats down, not from social ambition, but because all the other chairs were occupied and the ship was a small world. Blake noticed she was staring out the porthole at the waterline. He noticed she was not eating so much as maintaining caloric function. He noticed she had counted every person who entered the mess since she'd sat down. Not conspicuously, not in a way he could specifically name, but in the way that you notice a person's eyes tracking a room and realize they've logged more information in 3 minutes than you would in 3 hours. "You okay, ma'am?" he said. "Just counting," she said. Blake looked at the porthole, at the waterline, at the passageway beyond. "Counting what?" Dahlia said nothing, but her eyes had completed one more circuit of the room's 4 exit points, the positions of the 8 personnel currently seated, and the approximate response time of the security station 2 corridors down. Blake decided not to ask again. The order came at 17:15 hours. Fletcher delivered it in person, which suggested he had been sent by someone who wanted it done without an official paper trail. He knocked twice on the supply annex doorframe and stood with the particular ease of a man delivering news he considers someone else's problem. "Your contract has been canceled," he said. "Administrative error on the shore side. Scheduling conflict with another vessel's K9 support window. The ship will coordinate transport to the pier at 1700. Dahlia set down the inventory manifest she'd been reviewing. "Understood." Fletcher waited. He was the kind of person who expected reactions to operate as feedback. A small shock, some protest, a request for clarification that would let him demonstrate his authority to smooth things over. Dahlia produced none of these. She folded the manifest, set it on the supply ledge with the edge aligned to the corner, and stood. "Is there anything I need to sign?" Fletcher blinked. "The transport officer will handle paperwork." "Okay." She picked up her bag. "Thank you for the notice, Major." Fletcher left first. He told himself she was simply professional, and that professional people accepted administrative corrections without theatrics. He did not examine why the exchange had left him feeling like he'd expected to win a game that had not actually been played. Aiden intercepted Dahlia in the Kennel Bay corridor. He was carrying Titan's evening intake kit, and his face had the controlled expression of someone choosing his words with both hands. "I heard," he said, "about the contract cancellation. These things happen. Ma'am, this specific thing didn't happen by accident. Colonel Cassian asked Major Fletcher to find a reason." He stopped himself. "I shouldn't have said that." "You shouldn't have," she agreed. "Don't do it again." Aiden exhaled. Is there anyone I should contact? If you have a supervisor or a contracting officer, I have exactly what I need." She shifted the bag on her shoulder. "Make sure Titan gets his full intake tonight. He's been distracted and he'll want to skip the last half. Don't let him." She moved toward the Kennel Bay door, stopped with her hand on the frame. "Aiden?" "Yes, ma'am." "The scar on the inside of Rex's left foreleg. It's older than the current strain. Someone treated it before, in the field, without proper surgical equipment. Whoever that person was, they did a good job with what they had." A pause. "Make sure whoever documents Rex's medical history notes that. It matters for future protocol." She walked into the Kennel Bay without waiting for a response. Through the Kennel Bay's observation glass, Aiden watched her stand outside Titan's kennel. She did not open the door. She crouched to eye level with the animal, and for a moment, the two of them regarded each other in the way that certain beings communicate. Not through language, not through gesture, but through the simple geometric fact of shared attention. Titan stood, pressed his muzzle through the kennel door's gap. Dahlia reached through and placed her palm flat against the side of his face. The specific contact point that activates the vagal response in working dogs. The place behind the jaw that lowers heart rate and cortisol and says, in whatever language dogs use for such things, "I was here. I will have been here, even after I go." Aiden realized, standing in the corridor with a bowl of kibble going cool in his hands, that the small tag on Titan's collar had been checked and replaced this morning, and that the serial number on that tag corresponded to a specific record in a specific database, and that he was probably going to think about all of this for the rest of his career. He went back to prepare the evening feeding. He did not notice Dahlia remove one hand from Titan's face and use the other to unhook the small secondary tag from the collar ring, a tag so thin it was nearly invisible. Examine the embossed lettering on its underside, and replace it with the careful movements of someone confirming that a very specific piece of information is exactly where it should be. Boyce noticed. He had been standing in the bay's secondary access corridor since 1650 hours, and he had his phone out. This photograph, unlike the previous ones, he did not show to Cassian first. He sent it directly to Solomon's line. The Admiral's response came in 3 words. "Security hold. Now." Hugo received the order at 1740 hours. He took 2 enlisted personnel and walked to the supply annex. Dahlia was at the corner table, reading. Not a phone, a physical book, the kind that required page numbers to hold your place. "Ma'am," Hugo said, "please come with us." Dahlia dog-eared page 237. She did not use a bookmark. She simply marked the number in her mind, closed the cover, and stood. Hugo walked a half step behind her to the right. Standard escort positioning for personnel who have not been formally charged with anything but cannot be allowed full freedom of movement. Dahlia walked it without requiring adjustment. She matched the pace, maintained the spacing, moved through hatches at the correct yield angle for a 3-person formation in a narrow corridor. She had walked like this before, in many different corridors, in many different buildings, in many places that were considerably less comfortable than a naval vessel in Norfolk Harbor, but none of that was visible. None of that was on her badge, or her contractor file, or her worn-out blue uniform. It was only in the way she moved, and in the 14 animals on the K-9 deck below, who had, at the precise moment the escort formation began moving, turned their heads in unison toward the starboard corridor, and gone very, very still. The interrogation room on Deck 4 was not designed for interrogation. It was a repurposed equipment storage space, 12 feet by 8, 2 folding chairs, a table bolted to the wall, fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency slightly below conscious perception. The Navy used rooms like this the way organizations use small spaces throughout history, to make people feel the weight of institutional attention. Dahlia sat in the chair facing the door. She had placed her bag on the floor beside her left foot, where she could feel it without looking at it. She had her hands folded on the table in front of her, not clasped, not tense, simply resting. Her breathing was in the low range of a person who has either spent years in contemplative practice or spent years in situations where elevated breathing was operationally disadvantageous. She had been in this room for 11 minutes when Cassian entered. He brought Ronan, not as a witness, as an audience. Cassian was the kind of commander who derived confirmation from having observers, the way some men need to see their own reflection to believe the argument they're making. Cassian set a tablet on the table. He did not sit. "What were you doing with Titan's collar?" Dahlia looked at the tablet without touching it. Checking the microchip serial number, the identification tag had surface wear consistent with extended saltwater exposure. The number was starting to degrade. "How did you know there was a microchip?" Every military working dog in the continental United States K-9 program has been microchipped since 2007. It's standard protocol. That's specific knowledge for a civilian veterinary technician. I've worked with military veterinary contracts for 9 years. She said it without emphasis, without the slight upward inflection that signals defensiveness. "It comes up." Cassian leaned on the table with both hands. It was a technique, physical proximity as psychological pressure, the establishment of size differential in a confined space. 9 years of employment records that have some interesting gaps, according to our intelligence officer. I wasn't aware my employment history was under review. It is now. Dahlia met his eyes. She had the particular stillness of a person who has been the subject of institutional review in rooms considerably less comfortable than this one, by people with considerably more institutional leverage than the colonel running a K-9 unit on a vessel where he'd served for 3 weeks. "Is there a specific regulation I violated that would require my detention?" she asked. The word detention landed with precision, not accusation, not aggression. Simply the correct legal terminology applied to the correct situation, which was its own kind of pressure. The pressure of someone who knows the rules of the game you're playing better than you do. Cassian straightened. "You touched an asset under my command without authorization. I checked a collar tag through a kennel door gap. I did not enter the kennel. I did not handle the animal." She paused. "If there are injury records associated with that collar tag that require chain of custody documentation, I'm happy to provide a written account of what I observed and why." Ronan, standing near the door, had stopped looking at Dahlia the way he'd looked at her in the supply annex. He was now looking at her the way a man looks at something he had categorized incorrectly and is trying to recategorize in real time. Cassian tried another angle. "The contracting company you listed, Allied Vet Services, does not appear on this vessel's contractor manifest for the current exercise window. Supplemental contract, coordinated through Norfolk Port Authority. The paperwork process is slower than the deployment window. It's a common administrative lag. We checked with Port Authority. Then you'll find the supplemental filing under the Q-4 Veterinary Support Addendum. It was submitted Tuesday." She held his gaze without effort. "If it hasn't been processed yet, that's a shoreside delay, not a vessel-side irregularity." Cassian stared at her. She had an answer for everything, delivered with the measured calm of someone who either had nothing to hide or had spent significant time preparing for exactly this conversation. He could not determine which, and that inability was producing in him a specific frustration, the frustration of a man who is accustomed to interviews resolving clearly, and watching this one refuse to do so. "Why," he said very carefully, "does a civilian veterinary technician know field pharmacological protocols, military microchip standards, K-9 gait injury assessment, and the behavioral conditioning triggers of an animal that has never been successfully approached by a new handler in 18 months? Dahlia was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Because I'm good at my job," she said. Ronan looked at the floor. Cassian straightened, picked up the tablet, and walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "You're not leaving this vessel tonight." He said it as if it were a punishment. "We'll continue this tomorrow when we have confirmation from Port Authority." He left. Ronan followed. Dahlia unfolded her hands, placed them in her lap, and looked at the buzzing fluorescent light above her head. She had been in 17 situations in her professional life that were objectively more dangerous than this one. She ranked them in order of ascending severity, as she sometimes did in quiet moments, and confirmed that this did not appear on the list. She refolded her hands. She waited. 3 decks up, in the intelligence workstation that smelled of cold coffee and circulated air, Iris was watching a progress bar that had been loading for 4 minutes and 21 seconds. She had submitted her Level 4 clearance request at 1540 hours. It had been approved at 1652 hours, a processing time that suggested the request had been reviewed by at least 2 intermediate checkpoints before authorization, which itself suggested that the information being requested was not the kind that moved through the system unobserved. The progress bar reached 100%. The file loaded. Iris read the first line. She read it again. She placed both hands flat on the desk, not in agitation, but in the specific deliberate gesture of a person who needs physical contact with a stable surface to continue processing what they have just read. Her palms were very still. Her breathing continued at its normal rate, which required active management because her heart rate had just moved into a range she associated with operational emergencies. She read the second line, the third. She closed the file, opened it again, confirmed she had not misread. There was a photograph, Naval Service photograph, standard format, younger face than the one currently sitting in the Deck 4 equipment room, but unmistakably the same geometry, same jaw, same set of the eyes, same quality of contained stillness, same person, different decade. Below the photograph, the service designation, the unit code, the command history. The program she had built, then commanded, then, at her own request, removed herself from, transferring into a civilian contractor role that would let her continue the work without the rank that had made the work increasingly difficult. 217 military working dogs currently in active service across 3 combat theaters, 4 carrier groups, and 11 domestic installations. Every one of them trained according to a protocol she had written. Every one of them carrying a collar tag with a secondary identification marker she had designed. Iris stood up. "Hugo," she said, her voice careful and exact. "I need to speak with Admiral Solomon, right now." Hugo looked up from his workstation with the expression of a man assessing whether this required him to stand. He read her face. He stood. "Is this—" "Bring Cassian," Iris said, "and bring the clearance tablet. He needs to see this directly." She was already moving toward the hatch. Below, on the K-9 deck, something was happening that had no entry in the USS Resolute's operational manual. All 14 dogs were standing. Not in the agitation pattern of animals responding to a threat stimulus. No elevated vocalizations, no aggressive posturing, no hackles raised. They stood in their individual kennels with the posture of animals at attention, which is not a posture that working dogs are trained to assume, because it is not a posture that working dogs need to be taught. It emerges from certain conditions, the way water finds level. All 14 were oriented toward the starboard corridor, toward Deck 4, toward a bolted wall table and a folding chair, and a woman with her hands folded in her lap. Aiden stood in the kennel bay entrance and watched this. He had been a K-9 handler for 14 months. He had worked with 7 different dogs across 3 facilities. He had attended 3 handler certification courses and 1 advanced behavior seminar. He had never seen anything like this. He pulled out his handler log and wrote, 14 animals, unified orientation, non-aggressive, sustained, duration, unknown onset, currently ongoing. He paused, added, no stimulus identified. Then he put the log away because he understood that what he had written was not accurate. The stimulus was identified. He simply did not yet have the language to put in an official document. Admiral Solomon was in his cabin reviewing the Thursday drill timeline when Hugo and Iris knocked. He admitted them with the practiced efficiency of a man who had long since stopped distinguishing between working hours and personal time. The cabin was sparse: a desk, a chair, a narrow bunk, a framed photograph of the Pacific Fleet that served as his only personal concession to decoration. Iris placed the clearance tablet on his desk without preamble. "Sir, you need to see this." Solomon picked it up. His reading pace was quick. A career of dense briefings had trained his eye to extract priority information from dense text. He read through the first segment. His thumb moved to scroll. He stopped scrolling. He went back to the top. He read it again. Cassian had arrived during the second reading. He stood near the cabin door, which was his instinctive positioning in spaces where he was uncertain of the power geometry. He could not see the tablet screen from where he stood, but he could see Solomon's face, and Solomon's face had produced an expression that Cassian had never seen on it before. It was not shock. Solomon was not the type of man who wore shock. It was something more precise than that. The specific realignment of a man who has just discovered that the map he has been reading is significantly smaller than the territory it represents. "Sir," Cassian said, "what's in the file?" Solomon did not answer immediately. He set the tablet on the desk, turned it face down, and looked at the space between his hands for a moment. Then he looked at Iris. "She came here voluntarily." "Yes, sir. Contractor badge, standard entry, no announcement. To check on Titan." "That appears to be the case." Solomon was quiet. "She wrote the integration protocol that runs this unit." "Every K-9 unit in the fleet, sir," Iris said. "The training manual that Colonel Cassian briefed from this morning, the certification standards, the handling protocols, the collar identification system, the microchip registry." A pause. "All of it." Cassian processed this. His mouth opened, no sound emerged. "She built the program," Iris continued, "with the particular restraint of a woman who understands that some information lands harder when delivered without editorial. Then she stepped back from it. The official record shows a personnel transition. The classified record shows the reason." "Which was," Solomon said. Iris glanced at the tablet. She determined that her rank was creating friction in implementation. Field units were deferring to her command authority instead of developing independent handler competency. So, she removed the rank from the equation. Another silence. The ship's engine produced its constant low vibration, the sound of contained propulsion that sailors stop hearing after the first week. "She's been doing contractor assessments," Iris continued, "visiting active vessels, checking on animals she trained, adjusting protocols where field conditions have drifted from the original framework." "Without identification," Solomon said. "Without identification, sir. Because if field units knew who was assessing them, they'd perform for the assessment instead of operating normally. She needs to see the actual state of the program, not the rehearsed version." Cassian was very still. He was replaying a sequence of events from the past 6 hours in a new order, and the new order produced conclusions that were landing in rapid succession, each one heavier than the last. Solomon picked up the tablet, turned it over, looked at the photograph one more time, then he stood. "Where is she now?" he said. "Deck 4 equipment room, sir," Hugo said. "Under security hold." Solomon moved toward the cabin door. He paused beside Cassian. He did not look at him. He simply said, in a register that was below anger and beyond it at the same time, "Come with me." On the K-9 deck, at the moment Solomon's cabin door opened and the formation began moving toward the lower decks, something shifted in the kennel bay. Titan stood, not with the energy of a dog responding to an auditory signal, with the energy of a dog who has decided. His kennel latch had been properly secured this time. Hugo had checked the mechanism personally after the morning's first breach. The latch held. Titan pressed against the kennel door and looked at it. Then he did something that Aiden, watching from 6 feet away, would describe in his incident log as applied mechanical reasoning, which was the most defensible phrase he could find for what he actually witnessed. The dog positioned his left paw at the latch's pressure point, the specific lateral load position that released the spring mechanism, and pushed. The kennel door opened. Titan walked out. He moved to the center of the bay and sat, looked toward the bay entrance. Then, one by one, in the particular order that the animals had established among themselves through 14 months of shared training and sleeping and operational proximity, the other 13 kennel doors opened, not all at once, in sequence, as if each animal waited for confirmation from the one before. 13 more dogs walked out, formed up behind Titan in a loose crescent, sat. Aiden pressed his back against the far wall and made a sound that he would later describe to Blake as, "Not a word," specifically. He picked up his radio handset. "Handler station to deck security," he said, with remarkable composure. I'm going to need some clarification on protocol for a situation that I don't think has a precedent in the current handbook." Solomon arrived on the K-9 deck at 18:22 hours, moving at the controlled pace of a man who has decided that his speed of movement will communicate his level of concern, and whose level of concern he intends to carefully regulate. He found 14 dogs in a loose formation across the kennel bay floor, all oriented toward the sealed hatch that led to the Deck 4 corridor. He found Aiden standing against the far wall, holding a radio handset, looking like a man who has been handed responsibility for an event he has no category for. He found Cassian 3 steps behind him, and Iris behind Cassian, and Hugo behind Iris. Solomon looked at the dogs, looked at the hatch, looked at Aiden. "Get her!" Hugo moved toward the Deck 4 stairwell. Cassian started to follow. Solomon put one hand on his arm without looking at him. "No," he said very quietly. "You stay here." Cassian stayed. In the Deck 4 equipment room, Dahlia was on page 243 of her book. She had found, after the interrogation, that the solitude had been useful, and that she was not as unaffected by the day's events as she had made herself appear. When the door opened and Hugo stepped in. "Ma'am," Hugo said. He had a new quality in his voice. Not warmth exactly, but the specific tonal adjustment of a man who has received information that has reclassified the person in front of him. "Admiral Solomon is requesting your presence on the K9 deck." Dahlia set the book down, marked page 243 in her memory, picked up her bag, stood. She followed Hugo through 3 corridor hatches and 1 stairwell, and she knew, from the pace, from Hugo's bearing, from the particular quality of institutional attention that had been following her since Iris had submitted her clearance request, that something had shifted. The weight of it had changed. She could feel it in the way Hugo held himself, in the slightly wider angle of the path he cleared for her. She had felt this before too, in different buildings. The moment the classification lifted and the rooms rearranged themselves, she did not allow herself to feel relieved, not yet. There was still the question of what the arrangement would look like once it settled. The K9 deck hatch opened in front of her. She stepped through. 14 dogs were standing now. They had risen from their seated crescent when her footfall had sounded in the corridor, the way animals respond not to sight or sound exclusively, but to the particular combination of both that their memory has encoded as significant. 14 animals, 14 different sets of eyes, all oriented toward the hatch. Titan took 3 steps forward and sat again. He was not agitated. He was, in the specific behavioral vocabulary of working dogs, reporting. Dahlia stopped inside the hatch. She looked at the formation. Something moved across her face. Not sentiment exactly, but recognition. The specific recognition of a person seeing their work in the world. The 15 years of protocol development. The hundreds of training hours. The careful construction of methods that would outlast her involvement with them. Made visible and physical and present in 14 animals who had learned to trust a certain calibration of attention and had not forgotten it. She breathed in once, out, steady. Admiral Solomon was standing at the far side of the bay, and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized. The expression of a man who has just finished reading something that has significantly revised his understanding of the room he is standing in. Behind him, Cassian. Fletcher, who had arrived during the dog formation event, and was standing near the secondary access with the Norwegian attaché and 2 French officers, all of whom had been in the adjacent corridor when the K9 Bay radio call had gone out and had followed the current of institutional movement without entirely understanding where it was going. Aiden at the Kennel Bay's edge, holding his empty radio handset like an anchor. Boyce near the secondary access corridor, holding his phone in one hand and looking at the photograph on its screen, and then at the woman in the doorway, and then at the photograph again. The ship's engines ran below them. The fluorescent bay lighting was flat and complete, the kind of light that leaves nowhere to stand in shadow. Nobody spoke. Boyce took 1 step forward. He was a man who had built a career on being first to act, on understanding that the space between an event and its reporting was where credit lived. He was running, in this moment, the calculation that had served him through 22 years of service, and the calculation was telling him that this was his opportunity, that he had photographic evidence of the contractor touching a classified asset, that he had flagged this to senior command, that the outcome of this flag was currently producing a significant moment that he had set in motion. He was not fast enough in understanding that the moment was not the kind he had calculated for. He moved across the bay floor. His hand found the fabric of Dahlia's contractor uniform at the shoulder. Not a strike, not a push, but a grip. The action of a man asserting physical claim over a situation he intends to control. Nobody goes anywhere until I understand what... The sound was specific. A short, flat tearing, like a page pulled from a binding. The pale blue fabric parted at the shoulder seam. The silence that followed was the kind that does not begin abruptly, but arrives. The way a tide arrives, filling every low place until the room is covered. Hugo's hand moved halfway to his sidearm and stopped. Fletcher stopped translating for the Norwegian attaché. Aiden's empty radio handset swung from his grip. On Titan's shoulder, visible through the torn fabric of a pale blue contractor uniform, a mark emerged into the bay's flat light that had not been visible for 6 hours. Not a decoration, not a personal choice. a service mark, the kind placed on record and on skin simultaneously, each confirming the other. The spread-winged eagle of national service, rendered in the formal style of institutional symbology, its talons gripping the crossed sword and olive branch of command designation. Below it, in a compressed typeface that was not available commercially, a sequence of alphanumeric characters. And below that, in Latin, 4 words that those who had received the same designation understood without translation. Fidelis usque ad mortem, faithful unto death. On the inner curve of the eagle's left wing, barely visible unless you knew to look, unless you had been trained to look, unless someone had shown you during a specific type of briefing in a specific type of room. The same secondary identifier that appeared on Titan's collar tag. Boyce was still holding the piece of fabric. He looked at it, looked at what it had uncovered. His hand opened. The fabric fell. He took 2 steps backward without meaning to. The silence continued for 3 full seconds. It was Titan who moved first. He stood, crossed the bay floor in 6 strides, and placed himself at Dahlia's left side. Not between her and the room, but beside her. In the position that working dogs assume when they are not protecting a person from something, but accompanying a person through something. His shoulder pressed against her leg with the calm weight of 14 months of certain memory. Then, the other 13 dogs stood. They did not rush. They did not cluster. They moved with the measured, unhurried organization of animals who understand their role and are executing it, crossing the kennel bay floor in pairs and in sequence, settling around Dahlia in the crescent formation that had originally been their seated arrangement, now tightened, now deliberate, now a shape that even people who had never studied working dog behavior could read as unambiguous. 14 animals. 1 center point. 1 woman in a torn blue uniform who was looking at a spot on the far wall and breathing at exactly the same rate she had maintained for the past 6 hours. The Norwegian attaché said something quietly in Norwegian. Nobody translated it. It did not require translation. Solomon had not moved. He had been standing at the far side of the kennel bay when the fabric tore, and he had read the mark in the time it took most people in the room to understand that something significant was visible. He had read the identifier below it. He had connected it with the speed of a man who has spent decades processing classified information at operational tempo, to the file Iris had opened on his cabin desk, to the photograph in that file, to the 217 dogs currently serving in his fleet and every fleet allied with it. He reached into his uniform pocket, retrieved nothing, put his hand back at his side. He walked across the kennel bay floor. His footsteps were even, unhurried, each one deliberate in the way that a man's footsteps become deliberate when he is walking toward a moment that he understands will be definitive. 14 dogs watched him. He moved through the outer edge of their crescent. They parted, not from submission but from recognition, and stopped at a distance of 3 paces from Dahlia. She was looking at him now. He brought his right hand to his brow. The salute was textbook, not the abbreviated acknowledgement of administrative courtesy, not the quick formality of a passing hallway exchange, but the full-duration formal salute of official recognition, held at regulation angle for the complete statutory interval, in front of every witness currently present in the kennel bay of USS Resolute at 1826 hours on a Wednesday afternoon in Norfolk Harbor. An admiral saluting a woman in a torn contractor uniform with no rank insignia, no cap, no indication of her standing beyond a service mark on her left shoulder, and 14 military working dogs arranged around her in silent formation. The bay did not erupt. It did not break into noise or movement. It simply deepened. The way a room deepens when the thing that was true has been spoken aloud, and there is no longer any alternative version of events available. Cassian, standing behind and to Solomon's left, looked at the salute, looked at Dahlia, looked at the file that Iris was holding on the clearance tablet, which had rotated so that the photograph was now visible to him from his angle. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the face above the torn contractor uniform. His jaw moved once, then it stopped moving. Something in his posture changed. Not collapsing exactly, but the way a structure changes when one of its load-bearing assumptions is removed. He did not look away. The men who had worked beside Cassian for years would have identified this as unusual. He was a man who looked away from things that were inconvenient, who redirected attention by redirecting his own gaze. He did not do that now. He held the account. Fletcher, standing with the international delegation, was no longer attempting to translate. The Norwegian attaché had stopped needing him to. Boyce stood beside the secondary access corridor, with the piece of torn pale blue fabric still on the floor at his feet. He was looking at his hands as if they had performed an action he had not authorized. Aiden, at the kennel bay's edge, exhaled a sound that was not a word. Then he straightened, adjusted his bearing to something that might be called reflexive attention, and pressed his lips together. He did not look away from Dahlia. He did not look at the fabric on the floor. He looked at her, and what was on his face was not surprise. He had understood something was wrong with his initial assessment hours ago, but confirmation. The specific relief of a person whose instinct has been validated. Blake, who had followed the flow of personnel movement from the enlisted mess and was standing just inside the secondary access door frame, remembered a conversation at a porthole, just counting. He understood now what she had been counting and why, and what it said about the quality of attention that had been present in that mess hall when he'd thought he was sitting next to a civilian technician eating a late lunch. Solomon lowered his salute. The room breathed. Before we get to what Admiral Solomon does next, and you need to see this, a quick word from today's sponsor. If you've been struggling with focus and mental clarity, you're going to want to hear about our sponsor today. Their formula is specifically designed for sustained concentration without the crash. The kind of focus this story requires just to keep up. Use code RESOLUTE at checkout for 20% off your first order. Link in the description. Okay, back to USS Resolute. Because Cassian just saw Dahlia's classified file, and the color has completely drained from his face, Solomon turned to Iris. Brief Admiral's room, 15 minutes. Then to Dahlia. Ma'am, my apologies for today. 6 words, delivered with the same certainty as every order he had issued over the past decade. No qualification, no bureaucratic softening. An apology as direct as a navigation correction. Here is where we were. Here is where we are. Here is the adjustment. Dahlia received it with a nod. Thank you, Admiral. Solomon moved toward the hatch. He paused beside Cassian, not stopping, not turning, simply slowing enough for the words to land at the correct distance. In my office, 2000 hours. Bring your incident reports. Cassian said nothing. There was nothing available to say. Iris fell into step beside Dahlia as the formation dispersed. She had the tablet in her hand and the expression of a woman who has a professional obligation to ask the question she is about to ask, even though the social calculus is complicated. When Ronan flagged the pharmacology exchange, Iris said, I pulled your file. I know. I want you to understand that the escalation was appropriate, Dahlia said. It was the right call, exactly what a competent intelligence officer should do with an anomalous background query. She paused. You're good at your job. Iris absorbed this. Is there anything in the incident record that you want formally corrected before it goes to the permanent log? Dahlia glanced at her. Make sure Rex's treatment protocol is documented with proper chain of custody. And note that Titan's collar tag serial number was verified by an authorized program personnel during this visit. It'll matter for the 3-year inventory audit. I'll handle it. Also note that the Q-4 supplemental contracting addendum is real. It just hasn't processed yet. Don't let Cassian log it as a false credential. Understood. They walked in parallel for a moment. You could have identified yourself at any point today, Iris said, not as an accusation, as an observation with genuine curiosity in it. Yes, Dahlia said. Why didn't you? Dahlia was quiet for 3 steps. Because the moment I identify myself, people start performing for me instead of operating normally. I needed to see how this unit actually functions. She glanced toward the kennel bay. The animals don't perform. That's the thing about dogs. You can't brief them on how to behave for an assessment visit. They just are. They respond to what's actually there. Iris thought about the 14 dogs standing in a kennel bay, oriented toward a Deck 4 equipment room, waiting. And what did you find in the assessment? Aiden has excellent instincts, Dahlia said. The animal care protocols need updating. The gait assessment procedure for field injuries has drifted from the standard. Titan's physical therapy has been under-prioritized since an injury last year that apparently didn't make it fully into the incident report. Iris filed that last piece with the particular efficiency of someone who understands it will be relevant later. And the unit leadership. A pause that was its own kind of answer. Leadership is adjustable, Dahlia finally said. The animals are the constant. If the animals are sound, the unit can recover from almost anything else. Cassian found her before Solomon's 2000 meeting. He came alone, which was itself an adjustment. A man who had never entered a room that day without subordinates or equivalents positioned to witness him. He stopped in the doorway of the supply annex. Did not cross the threshold. Dahlia was at the corner table with her book. She looked up. Cassian was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had spent a career in rooms where language was the primary instrument of authority. and he was standing at the edge of a room where he had no idea what language was adequate. "Ma'am," he said, then stopped, started again. He stopped again. Dahlia watched him with the patience of someone who has watched many people try to compress a day's worth of poor decisions into a single sentence. "Titan," she said, "needs physical therapy sessions 3 times per week for the next 4 weeks. His left shoulder sustained a stress injury during a maritime boarding exercise in November. The full severity wasn't captured in the incident report that reached command. Aiden can execute the therapy if he's given protected time for it." Cassian took a slow breath. "I'll authorize it." "Thank you." A moment. "I should have," Cassian began. "Tomorrow," Dahlia said, not unkindly. "There's a lot that can wait until tomorrow. The therapy schedule can't." He nodded once, turned to go. "Colonel," he stopped. "The demo this afternoon," Dahlia said. "Titan's incomplete run. That was about the shoulder, not about the behavioral conditioning. He's been overcompensating for the injury, and it manifests as refusal behaviors under sustained command pressure. Once the therapy resolves the physical issue, the refusal pattern should self-correct." Cassian absorbed this. "How long have you known about the shoulder?" "Since this morning," she said, "when I watched him move across the kennel bay." She went back to her book. Cassian walked towards Solomon's office, carrying 22 years of service and the specific weight of a man recalibrating the difference between authority and competence. The consequence cascade began quietly, the way consequences usually do, not with proclamations, but with paperwork. Boyce was escorted to Hugo's administrative office at 19:15 hours. The formal charge, unauthorized physical contact with a protected program personnel during an active evaluation exercise. He sat in the chair across from Hugo's desk and looked at his own hands for a long time. Hugo processed the preliminary report with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had handled 32 years of institutional incidents and understood that the work was in the documentation. Boyce's 22 years of accumulated operational credit would navigate this, eventually, but the navigation would not be comfortable, and the process would leave marks. He had taken photographs and sent them upward. He had acted from the instinct of a man who valued being first. He would spend a significant portion of his remaining service career understanding that first and right operate on separate timelines, and that confusing them has costs. Fletcher's consequence was subtler and therefore more permanent. He had been the visible face of a delegation that had witnessed an admiral deliver a formal salute to a contractor. The NATO evaluation panel had not been briefed, could not be briefed, and had filed their preliminary assessment that evening, an assessment that noted the K-9 unit's operational coherence with particular interest, and that described an undisclosed demonstration of handler-animal relationship as the most authentic unit dynamic observed across all 3 vessels. Fletcher would read that assessment 6 weeks later and understand, without being told, that the highest scoring moment in the evaluation had occurred without his management and despite his interference. Ronan found Aiden in the kennel bay at 19:40 hours during the evening feeding round. The conversation was brief. "She knew the ace-promazine-metatomidine distinction cold," Ronan said, "not the textbook version. The operational version. The version you only know if you've administered it in field conditions." Aiden kept his eyes on Titan's intake bowl. "Yes, sir." "How long did you know something was different about her?" Aiden thought about this with genuine care. "About 11 minutes after I first spoke with her," he said. "She told me something about Titan's hindquarter tension from underfueling that I've never read in any handbook. That's not the kind of thing you know, unless you watched a lot of dogs do it." Ronan was quiet. "I challenged her, in the supply annex." "I heard." She answered correctly. More than correctly. A pause. "I left because I didn't have a follow-up question." "I should have had a follow-up question. I should have stayed." Aiden looked at him. "What would you have asked?" Ronan thought about it. "I would have asked who trained her." He looked at the kennel bay floor. "I think the answer would have been interesting." Solomon's meeting with Cassian lasted 38 minutes. The incident reports were reviewed. Certain language was revised. The formal log would reflect an administrative clearance discrepancy that had been resolved, a security hold that had been lifted upon identity verification, and a contracted assessment visit that had been conducted successfully. The informal understanding, the one that lives in the space between institutional language and actual events, was considerably more complete. At the end of the meeting, Solomon said, "The K-9 integration protocol on this vessel. You briefed from it this morning?" "Yes, sir." "Before today, did you know who authored it?" Cassian held the question honestly. "No, sir." "Read the authorship section. It's in the appendix." Solomon set the tablet down. Then read the philosophy of assessment section, the part about why the author chose to remove rank from the equation. A pause. It will give you some things to consider about how we measure competence and what we use as proxies for it. Cassian left with the tablet under his arm. He would read both sections that night, in his quarters, and he would read them the way a person reads something that has been written about a room they have been standing in while looking the wrong direction. Dahlia was at the Kennel Bay's edge at 2100 hours, preparing to leave for the pier transport. Aiden was running Titan's evening final check, the behavioral closeout that good handlers perform before lights out, confirming rest posture, water intake, and kennel security. Titan was watching Dahlia. Aiden finished his check and crossed to where she was standing. He had been building towards something for 3 hours, turning it over with the careful attention he gave to anything he wanted to get right, and he had arrived at the simplest possible version of it. "Ma'am," he said, "the word you used. This morning, when Titan was in the training bay and you knocked on the wall, and this evening, when you sent them all back to their kennels." He paused. It was the same word. Dahlia looked at him. "What does it mean?" Aiden said. She reached into her bag, found a small notepad, the kind with a wire binding and stiff cover that field personnel carry when they need documentation that survives weather. She wrote one word on the top page, tore it out, and held it toward him. Aiden took it, read it. "How do you pronounce it?" she told him. Said it once, slowly, with the particular placement of the consonants that the language required. "And the meaning?" Dahlia looked at Titan, who was watching her from his kennel, with his chin resting on his folded forepaws. "It means, I trust you." Aiden held the piece of paper. He thought about 14 months of working with an animal that had been brought to him already formed by someone else's method, already shaped by someone else's understanding, already carrying in its behavioral patterns the compressed legacy of a program he had been implementing without knowing its source. "Thank you," he said. Dahlia nodded. She moved toward the Kennel Bay exit. "Ma'am," he called it after her, "will you come back for Titan's reassessment at the end of the 4 weeks?" She stopped at the hatch, did not turn. "If the therapy goes the way it should, he won't need me for the reassessment." A pause. "That's the point." She walked through the hatch. Iris caught up with her at the carrier's main access ramp at 2120 hours. The Norfolk night had the particular quality of harbor evenings, the smell of salt and diesel, the distant light of the pier, the low sound of water against the hull that persisted through every other ambient noise. "They have a transport ready," Iris said. "But I want to say something." Dahlia waited. "With your record," Iris said, "with everything in that file, you could be at the Pentagon. You could be running the program from a command position. You could have rank insignia and an office and people who know your name before you walk into a room." Dahlia looked at the harbor, at the dark water, at the lights of the pier. "The dogs don't know where I'm sitting," she said. "They only know whether I'm there." She descended the ramp toward the pier. USS Resolute's evening lights were coming on. The navigation beacons, the deck floods, the running lights along the carrier's waterline. The ship's geometry became architectural in the dark, all angles and mass and the quiet authority of a structure built for purpose. In the Kennel Bay, Titan lay in his kennel with his chin on his forepaws. The other 13 animals had settled into their rest postures, the specific arrangement of animals at the end of a high-stimulus day, bodies releasing the tension that accumulated attention produces. Aiden sat on a low stool near Kennel 7. He had the piece of notepad paper in his hand. He was practicing the pronunciation, quietly, under the ambient sound of the ship's systems, so that the word was just above silence. Blake appeared in the Kennel Bay doorway. He had been tracking the day's events through the ship's social network with a particular speed of information in confined spaces, and he had been processing one specific piece of it for several hours. "She said she was counting," he told Aiden. "In the mess. I asked her what she was counting." Aiden looked up. "What did she say?" "Nothing. She didn't answer." Blake looked at the Kennel Bay, at the 14 animals in their rest positions. "I thought she meant the exits, or the personnel, some kind of threat assessment." "Maybe she was," Aiden said. Blake shook his head slowly. "I've been thinking about it, the way she looked at the room. She wasn't counting threats." He paused. "She was counting assets. She was figuring out what she had to work with." Aiden thought about this, about a woman who had walked onto a vessel where no one knew who she was, assessed the operational status of the program she'd built, corrected 3 deficiencies, prevented 1 injury, and departed before anyone understood the full scope of what had happened. He looked at the piece of paper in his hand. "Yeah," he said. "I think that's right." 3 decks up, Solomon stood at his desk reviewing a document he had not opened in several years, the K9 Integration Protocol, Appendix Section, Author's Note. The language was direct and specific in the way that language becomes when a person has learned to say exactly what they mean and nothing beyond it. The purpose of this program is not to produce animals that perform well when observed. The purpose is to produce animals that operate correctly when no one is watching, including, and especially, their handlers. Assessment value is therefore maximized when the assessor is unknown to the unit being assessed. When rank is visible, performance adjusts to rank. When rank is absent, performance reveals itself. Solomon read the last line twice. What the program produces is not obedience. What the program produces is trust. The distinction matters more than any metric we currently use to measure it. He set the document down, looked at the photograph of the Pacific Fleet on his wall, thought about the ordering of the day's events, the contractor badge, the kennel incident, the demonstration, the interrogation, the database query, the fabric tear. Thought about 14 dogs, unified in orientation, in a bay that smelled of kibble and salt water, and the particular residue of institutional purpose. He picked up his secure line and began composing a message to the program coordinator at the Pentagon, requesting a formal review of the assessment visit protocol. The current system, his message would note, had significant gaps. A contractor could be detained under security hold for conducting an authorized assessment, and the authorization would not surface until a Level 4 clearance query was manually submitted. The system needed a better mechanism. He paused before sending. Added one line. The current protocol works, but only because the person running it is better than the protocol. That's not a sustainable foundation. Fix it before it costs us something we can't recover. He sent the message. Turned off the desk lamp. Listened to the ship. At the Norfolk Pier, Dahlia's phone vibrated. She was walking toward the long-term parking structure, her bag over one shoulder, moving at the pace of a person who has completed what she came to do and is not in a hurry to go somewhere else. The harbor behind her. The carrier's lights reflected on the water in broken geometric patterns, each wave reshaping the image and producing a version of the ship that was accurate but incomplete. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. No area code she recognized. She answered. USS Meridian, the voice said. Male, precise. The vocal register of someone accustomed to transmitting information under time pressure. K9 unit, deployment window in 6 days. How many animals? 11. She walked a few steps. The parking structure lights came on above her, motion activated, flooding the approach path with flat white light. Were any of them in the same training cohort as Titan? A pause, longer than a simple database query would require. The kind of pause that means the person on the other end has already looked this up, and the answer is complicated. Yes, ma'am. That's part of why we're calling. Dahlia stopped walking. She stood at the entrance to the parking structure and looked back at the harbor. USS Resolute's running lights burned steady in the darkness. Somewhere inside that ship, Aiden was sitting beside Kennel 7, practicing a word in Czech. Somewhere inside, Solomon was composing a message that would change a protocol. Somewhere inside, 14 animals were arranged in their kennels, in the specific posture of animals who have done what they came to do and are resting in the certainty of it. She looked at the harbor for a long moment. Send me the unit file, she said, and the incident logs for the past 6 months. All of them, not the summary. Yes, ma'am. I'll be in touch. She ended the call, put the phone in her bag, looked at the water one more time. Titan was looking south from his kennel window at this moment. Aiden would notice it and log it, because Aiden was the kind of handler who noticed things and logged them now, who had learned today that the details that seemed peripheral were sometimes the load-bearing structure. The dog was oriented not toward the pier, not toward the direction Dahlia had walked, but toward the southern harbor entrance, toward the channel where vessels inbound from the Atlantic would pass, toward where USS Meridian would anchor in 6 days. Dahlia walked to her car. She drove south through Norfolk with the windows down, the harbor smell giving way to the broader night air of the coastal city. She was not thinking about today in any comprehensive way. The day would process itself over the following weeks, the way significant events do, surfacing in pieces at irregular intervals until they have been fully integrated. She was thinking about 11 dogs she hadn't seen in 18 months, about the cohort she had trained in the program's 3rd year, when the methodology was still being refined, when she was still learning which elements of the protocol were fundamental and which were adjustable. About one training session in particular, a gray November morning at the facility in Quantico, when the cohort had worked a building search exercise and every animal had completed it independently, without handler direction, simply by understanding the problem and solving it. She had stood at the edge of the exercise space and watched 11 dogs work and thought, this is what it looks like when the thing you built works. Not perfectly. They were young, the protocols were still developing, but correctly, in the right direction, with the right foundation. She had written the assessment note that evening. Cohort 3 shows strong independent problem-solving capacity. Recommend advancing to Phase 2, integration. She wondered how they'd managed 18 months on their own. She thought about what the pause had meant on that phone call. She turned north at the harbor junction, changed direction. Some things couldn't wait 6 days to find out. The last light on USS Resolute went off at 23:40 hours. The ship settled into its nighttime operational rhythm. Reduced crew, steady instrument readings, the ongoing work of a vessel that is never fully at rest. In Kennel 7, Titan had shifted to his sleeping position. Left side down, rear legs extended, the specific configuration of a dog that has resolved its day and released the accumulated alertness of it. His breathing was slow and even in the way of working dogs in genuine rest. Not the shallow, vigilant sleep of high-stress environments, but the deep physiological settling of an animal that has been in the presence of something it completely trusts. The small secondary tag on his collar carried its information into the dark. Embossed lettering on its underside, invisible in the kennel's dimness. Letters that matched the mark on a left shoulder in a torn blue uniform, somewhere south of Norfolk on a coastal highway, moving toward the harbor at Chesapeake. Fidelis usque ad mortem. The best ones don't leave their names. They leave the dogs who remember them, and the handlers who have learned finally to pay attention. Dahlia never asked for a salute. She never asked to be recognized, never announced her credentials, never corrected the people who dismissed her. She simply did her work, the way she had always done it, quietly, precisely, and completely. And the dogs remembered. There is something profound in that. We live in a world that rewards loudness, that mistakes confidence for competence, titles for ability, visibility for value. We have built systems that measure people by what they display rather than what they've built, by the insignia on their collar rather than the integrity in their character. But working dogs don't read insignia. They read truth. They read the quality of attention someone brings into a room, the steadiness of hands that have done difficult things and kept going, the specific frequency of someone who has earned trust through years of quiet, unglamorous, essential work. 14 animals knew who Dahlia was before any database confirmed it, before any admiral saluted, before any file was opened. They knew because she had been there, present, consistent, faithful, long before anyone thought to ask her name. The lesson is not complicated. The people who build the foundations rarely stand on them. The ones who train the next generation rarely take credit for what that generation becomes. Real service doesn't seek recognition. It seeks results. It asks only one question. Is the work being done correctly? If this story moves something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about the people history forgets to mention. And leave a comment. Who in your life has been a Dahlia